My own children flew in all smiles and concern and tricked me into signing away a multi-million-dollar inheritance I had just received. They thought I was just a confused old woman, an inconvenient problem to manage, while they carved up my future to pay for their mistakes and save their perfect high-status lives. But they underestimated me. They had no idea their simple, quiet mother was about to serve a dish of justice so cold it would shatter their entire world. My 65th birthday was a quiet affair. That's a gentle way of saying I spent it alone. The old house was still filled only with the scent of sea salt from the Sound and the lemon polish I'd used on the baby grand piano that morning. I'd played a little Chopin, my fingers still nimble enough to find the melancholy in the chords, a skill I'd honed at Juilliard before life had other plans for me. The phone calls, when they came, were like brief, jarring interruptions in a long, quiet piece of music. First, Amanda from her sprawling home in Greenwich. Her voice was bright and breathless, a performance of affection squeezed between what sounded like a caterer and a personal trainer. She spoke of her lifestyle brand's latest gala, a flurry of names I didn't recognize, and how utterly exhausted she was. The birthday wish felt like an item checked off a to-do list. I noticed her smile even through the phone line. It was the same one she used in her social media posts, wide and brilliant, but never quite reaching her eyes. Michael called an hour later from his office in the city, the sounds of trading floor chaos bleeding through the line. He was all brisk efficiency, a man whose time was measured in dollars per second. He wished me well, then immediately pivoted, telling me it was for my own good, that he was being so practical, that in this market you have to be aggressive just to stay afloat. He told me he was closing a deal that would be a game changer. I could almost picture him leaning back in his leather chair, one hand gesturing dismissively while the other held his phone, his eyes already on the next screen, the next opportunity. His love was like his investments, allocated strategic and expecting a return. The neglect wasn't malicious. It was worse. It was casual. It was the simple, unthinking consequence of me no longer being relevant to their upward trajectory. A few days later, a thick, cream-colored envelope arrived. It was from a law firm in Mystic, a name I didn't know. Inside, the language was dense and formal, but the meaning was shockingly clear. My cousin Eleanor, whom I hadn't seen in 20 years, had passed away, and she had left me everything. Her entire estate. The letter listed assets that made my head spin, but one item stood out: a property known as Sea Glass, a multi-million-dollar villa on the coast, complete with a substantial portfolio to maintain it. When I called Amanda and Michael, the line went silent for a full 10 seconds before they both exploded with questions. Within hours, they were on my doorstep. It was an invasion, albeit a well-dressed one. Amanda's expensive perfume filled my small foyer, and the sound of Michael's rolling suitcase scuffed the old hardwood floors. Their excitement was electric, a raw, hungry thing they tried to mask with performative concern. They said they were only thinking of my security, that a woman my age with no experience in these matters could be taken advantage of. They talked about property taxes, capital gains, and legacy. Planning, their words flying around my quiet living room like frantic birds. Michael was constantly checking his phone, a tiny muscle in his jaw, twitching each time the screen lit up. He'd make a non-committal noise and say something about market volatility. Amanda, trying to project an image of serene control, chattered relentlessly about turning Sea Glass into a proper family compound, a place for the grandchildren, a tangible symbol of their success. It wasn't about my good fortune. It was about how my good fortune could be leveraged to enhance their brand. The next day, they took me to their trusted family lawyer. His office was a world of glass and steel, a place that made my modest life feel impossibly small. He spoke to me in a gentle, condescending tone, while Amanda and Michael nodded along their faces, grim with manufactured responsibility. They presented me with a thick stack of papers, telling me it was a standard estate setup, a way to put everything into an irrevocable trust to protect me from liability. They said it would simplify everything. I felt a small flutter of unease, a dissonance between their reassuring words and the frantic energy humming just beneath their skin. But they were my children. I looked at their anxious, earnest faces, and I signed where they told me to sign. That night, the house was quiet again, but the silence felt different. It was heavy, suffocating. I couldn't sleep. My mind snagged on the memory of the lawyer's smooth reassurances and the almost imperceptible tremor in Michael's hand as he'd passed me the pen. I got up for a glass of water, padding softly down the familiar hallway. As I passed the guest room, I heard a low murmur. I stopped, not meaning to eavesdrop, but the voice that leaked from under the door was not the confident sound of my son, the rising hedge fund manager. It was the thin, frayed whisper of a terrified man. "The crypto fund is gone," he hissed into the phone, the words sharp and cruel in the stillness of my home. All of it. If we don't liquidate some of Mom's new assets by the end of the quarter, they're going to call my loans. We'll be ruined. By the way, if you're enjoying the story so far, please consider subscribing so you don't miss what's next. We'd also love to hear your own story if you'd like to share it with our community. Now let's get back to it. I didn't sleep. I spent the night in a chair by the window watching the moon trace a path across the sound, my son's panicked words echoing in the silence. The shock didn't fade into grief as I expected. Instead, it slowly cooled and hardened into something else. Something heavy and solid, like a stone in the pit of my stomach. By the time the sun rose, casting a pale, watery light into the living room, the stone had a name resolve. The next morning, I was the first one up. I made coffee, the familiar ritual, a comfort. I set out the breakfast plates with a steady hand. When Amanda and Michael came down, they were back in character, confident, concerned, in control. They believed their plan was working perfectly. They saw their gentle, pliable mother easily overwhelmed and grateful for their expertise. They had no idea that the woman pouring their coffee had died in the hallway last night, and someone new was standing in her place. We sat at the kitchen table, the morning sun streaming in. I took a sip of my coffee, letting the warmth settle me. Then I turned to Amanda with what I hoped was a pleasant, thoughtful smile. I asked her about that beautiful caterer she'd used for her last brand event. What was their name? I told her I was thinking of hosting a small party at Seaglass, just a little something to meet my new neighbors. The effect was instantaneous. It was like I'd thrown a switch. Amanda's curated poise vanished. Her fork clattered against her plate. She stammered, her eyes wide with a flicker of pure panic, something about the caterer being fully booked for the foreseeable future. She knew, and I knew, that her brand was a glittering facade built on a mountain of debt, and that caterer likely hadn't been paid yet. Michael, seeing his sister flounder, jumped in immediately. His reaction wasn't subtle. It was pure aggression, disguised as fiscal prudence. He wanted to know why on earth I would spend money so frivolously. He said we needed a 5-year plan, a full financial workup, that a property like Seaglass was an asset, not a plaything. Amanda, recovering slightly, chimed in that the community was very exclusive and I would need to be properly introduced, that a party was premature. Their stories tumbled over each other, a frantic, contradictory mess of excuses. They were trying to build a cage around me with their words, and my simple question had just rattled the bars. I let them finish. I let the silence hang in the air for a moment, thick with their desperation. Then I looked at them, my children, and I spoke. My voice wasn't loud, but it was clearer and harder than they had ever heard it. I told them it was my house and my inheritance. I reminded them that I was a Juilliard-trained musician before they were ever born. I said I thought I could manage a housewarming party. They just stared at me. For the first time, they were utterly silent, their masks of concern and authority gone, replaced by matching expressions of stunned disbelief. They had forgotten who I was, so I had to remind them. In that moment, I felt a strange mix of emotions, a cold, grim satisfaction at their shock, but also a deep, aching fear. I knew I had just shown my hand. While they were still reeling, I excused myself, saying I needed to make a call. I walked into my bedroom, my heart pounding, and shut the door. I dialed a number I knew by heart. My oldest friend Eleanor picked up on the second ring. Ellie had been a legal secretary for a famously ruthless litigator for 40 years. She was sharper than a tack and loyal as the day is long. I didn't give her details, I couldn't risk it. I just told her in a calm, steady voice that I was having a bit of a family legal matter. I asked if she remembered how she always used to say, "Some paperwork needs a second set of eyes." I told her I had some paperwork. There was a pause on the other end, and then Ellie's voice, low and serious, said she understood. She said she'd start digging. I had an ally. I wasn't alone. But when I came out of the bedroom, the atmosphere in the house had changed completely. The panic had curdled into something uglier. Michael was standing by the door, my car keys dangling from his finger. Amanda was holding my iPad. They told me, their voices strained with that awful false kindness, that they were worried I was overstimulated. They said for my own safety, they thought it was best if they held on to these things for a while, just until we got everything settled. The cage was no longer being built with words. It now had bars. I had made my first move, and in their terror, they had revealed just how dangerous they were willing to be. When you've spent 15 years caring for ailing parents, you learn a thing or two about performing. You learn to smile when you're exhausted, to sound cheerful when you're heartbroken, and to project an aura of calm competence when you feel like you're splintering into 1,000 pieces. The next morning, I gave the performance of a lifetime. I was frail. I was confused. I let my hands tremble just so when I reached for my coffee cup. I apologized to Amanda and Michael for being so difficult the day before. I told them the shock of the inheritance had been too much, that my little outburst was just stress. I looked at them with wide, tired eyes and said they were right, that it was all far too much for me to handle. I told them to take care of the paperwork, that I trusted them to do what was best. I saw the look that passed between them, a flash of smug, triumphant relief. They believed they had won. They saw their docile, defeated mother, and they relaxed. I retreated to my bedroom, telling them I needed to rest, and closed the door on their satisfied smiles. While they celebrated their victory downstairs, I pictured the separate gilded hells they were living in. I didn't need to see the trading statements to know what Michael's face looked like when he saw them. I could almost see him in his glass-walled office high above Manhattan, the city glittering below him like a promise he couldn't keep. I imagined him staring at a screen filled with catastrophic red arrows, pointing down the entire value of his can't-miss crypto fund, vaporized into nothing. I could feel the cold sweat on his brow as the notification for a margin call popped up, a digital death sentence that meant his lenders were coming for everything. His entire identity, the one he'd built on being the smartest guy in the room, was about to be publicly dismantled. And Amanda, in that pristine Greenwich kitchen that looked like a magazine cover, her life curated down to the last organic lemon. I could picture her hiding a stack of crimson-red overdue invoices for her lifestyle brand in a drawer before her husband got home. I imagined the sting of a loan application being denied on her phone, the quiet, humiliating beep confirming she was a fraud. Her greatest fear wasn't poverty, it was insignificance. It was the terror of being exposed as a failure in front of the other wealthy wives in her circle, the women whose approval she craved like oxygen. They weren't just greedy, they were drowning, and they saw my inheritance as the only available lifeboat. While they were busy being relieved, I was busy getting to work. In the back of my closet behind a row of old winter coats was a dusty laptop case. Inside was an old, heavy laptop from before my husband passed, from before I even had an iPad. It took a full 5 minutes to boot up, groaning and whirring, like an old man getting out of a chair, but it connected to the Wi-Fi. My first email was to Eleanor. Her reply came in minutes. She had already found the name of a famously aggressive estate litigation lawyer in Hartford. Her message was simple. "This one eats people like your children for breakfast. Get me the paperwork." Getting it to her was the challenge. I took the thick stack of documents they'd had me sign, laid them out on my bed, and used the laptop's grainy built-in webcam to take a picture of each page. The images were blurry, shadowy, but they were legible. One by one, I attached them to a new email and sent them off into the ether, my heart pounding with every click. My counteroffensive had begun. Later that afternoon, believing I was napping, my children grew careless. They sat on the back patio just below my open bedroom window, their voices carrying clearly on the sea breeze. Their arrogance was breathtaking. I heard Michael's voice, sharp and dismissive, talking about selling off a parcel of the Seaglass property to cover what he called a temporary liquidity problem. Amanda agreed, suggesting they could probably get a good price for the guest house. Then they started laughing. They mocked my simple life, my old furniture, my complete inability to comprehend their sophisticated world. They were so sure of their victory, so confident in my weakness. They had no idea that on the nightstand next to my bed, my old laptop was open, its simple voice recorder app silently capturing every single condescending, incriminating word. For 2 days, I played the part of the frail, forgetful old woman. I rested. I sighed. I let them bring me tea and listened with feigned gratitude as they spoke of their plans to organize my affairs. They moved about my house with the smug confidence of heirs apparent, their victory so total they had stopped bothering to conceal it. They were careless. They were arrogant. And all the while, the small, damning audio file sat on my laptop's desktop, a digital time bomb, waiting for the right moment to detonate. That moment arrived on a Tuesday afternoon with the chime of the doorbell. Michael and Amanda exchanged an annoyed look, irritated by the interruption to their planning. I rose slowly from my chair, playing my part to the end, and walked to the door. On the porch stood my old friend Eleanor. But she wasn't alone. Beside her was a woman who looked as if she were carved from granite and dressed in a tailored suit of armor. She was tall, with sharp eyes that missed nothing, and she carried a leather briefcase like a weapon. I opened the door and invited them in. As they stepped into my living room, Michael and Amanda rose, their faces a mixture of confusion and irritation. Eleanor smiled at me, a quick, reassuring gesture before stepping aside. The woman in the suit stepped forward. She introduced herself as Ms. Albright, an attorney from Hartford. She said she was representing me. The shift in the room was seismic. Michael immediately puffed up his voice, loud and blustering, as he threatened lawsuits against anyone trying to interfere in a private family matter. Amanda, ever the performer, tried to play the part of the calm, concerned daughter, her voice dripping with syrupy condescension as she explained that her poor mother was confused that she was being manipulated by outsiders. Ms. Albright was completely unfazed. She waited for them to finish her expression unchanging. Then she opened her briefcase and placed a single sheet of paper on the coffee table. She calmly informed them that she had an hour ago filed an emergency petition with the state court to contest the irrevocable trust on the grounds of elder fraud and undue influence. Then she pushed the paper towards my son. It was a printout from a financial news site, a public notice of the complete and total collapse of Michael's crypto fund. The color drained from Michael's face. All the bluster, all the arrogant confidence evaporated in an instant, leaving behind the raw, clammy terror I'd heard in his voice on the phone. He was exposed. Before he could even speak, Ms. Albright turned to Amanda, who was still trying to maintain her composure. From her briefcase, she produced a second document. She said that in the course of her due diligence, she had discovered a notice of default filed against Amanda's business for the loan on her retail space in Greenwich. That was the spark that lit the fuse. Michael stared at his sister, his face a mask of horrified betrayal. He said he thought her brand was profitable, that she had told him it was. Amanda's composure finally shattered, and she shrieked back at him that he had told her his fund was the next big thing, that he was a genius. The carefully constructed alliance between them dissolved into a spectacular explosion of mutual blame and recrimination. The secrets they had been keeping even from each other came pouring out in a torrent of ugly, desperate honesty. He accused her of being a fraud obsessed with appearances. She accused him of being a reckless gambler who had ruined them both. They were no longer the power couple from the city and the suburbs. They were just two terrified people watching their worlds crumble, and their first instinct was to tear each other apart. Their pain was real, I could see that. And in a strange, distant part of my heart, I felt a flicker of sorrow for the broken people my children had become. I let their rage burn until it began to sputter out, leaving them panting and glaring at each other in the wreck of my living room. Then I spoke a single word. Enough. My voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the chaos like a shard of ice. They both turned to look at me, their faces stained with tears and fury. I held up my old laptop, which I'd brought from the bedroom, and I pressed play. Their own voices filled the room, their condescending, mocking voices from the patio 2 days ago. We heard them laughing about my simplicity. We heard them planning which parts of my home, my legacy, they would sell off first. We heard their contempt, their dismissal of me as an irrelevant old woman who was merely an obstacle to their financial recovery. The effect was devastating. The anger drained out of them, replaced by a deep, profound, and public shame. They couldn't argue. They couldn't deny it. They could only stand there exposed by their own words. I had reclaimed my power. I looked not at my children, but at Ms. Albright. I thanked her for coming. Then I told her that my children and I would be meeting again on Thanksgiving at Sea Glass. We would be there, I said, to discuss the terms of their disinheritance, and she would be there to mediate. And with that, I turned and walked back to my bedroom, leaving them standing powerless and terrified in the ruins of the world they had built on lies. The weeks leading up to Thanksgiving were silent and heavy. After the confrontation in my living room, Amanda and Michael had retreated, vanishing back to their separate lives to await their judgment. They didn't call. They didn't write. The silence was a confession in itself. I used that time to move into Sea Glass to let the grand, beautiful house settle around me. Its vast rooms filled with the scent of old books and salt air didn't feel lonely. They felt like potential. They felt like the future. Thanksgiving Day was cold and gray, the sky over the Long Island Sound, the color of slate. The dining room at Sea Glass was magnificent, with a long mahogany table polished to a mirror shine, but it was not set for a feast. It was set for a reckoning. At the head of the table, I sat with Ms. Albright to my right. To my left sat a kind, steady man in his late 50s named David, my late cousin Eleanor's son. And across from us, looking small and pale in the cavernous room, sat Amanda and Michael. I let the silence stretch for a moment, letting the weight of the occasion settle on them. Then I began to speak. I told them about my cousin, about her quiet wisdom and her deep understanding of human nature. And then I told them about the secret codicil in her will. I explained that the inheritance wasn't a gift, but a test. A 1-year test of character designed to see if her wealth would be treated with respect and kindness. It was a test I told them that they had failed in less than a week. With Ms. Albright occasionally providing a calm, factual detail, I laid out every deception. The rushed visit, the manufactured concern, the fraudulent trust they'd tricked me into signing the confiscation of my keys and iPad. I spoke calmly, my voice even, but every word was a stone laid on the wall between us. It was Amanda who broke first. The carefully constructed facade of the Greenwich socialite finally shattered, and she began to sob. Not with performative tears, but with the racking, ugly cries of genuine despair. Through her gasps, the raw truth came out. She spoke of the crushing debt, the terror of her friends, discovering her brand was a failure, the unbearable, relentless pressure to maintain a life she couldn't afford. She said she couldn't stand the thought of failing in front of everyone, that the shame of it was everything. Michael sat rigid for a few moments longer, his face a stone mask. But as his sister's confession filled the room, his own defenses crumbled. The anger he had hidden behind for so long dissolved, and he slumped forward in his chair, his head in his hands. He admitted everything. The catastrophic loss of his fund, the margin calls the sheer animal terror of being exposed as a failure in the world that had defined him. His voice was barely a whisper when he finally looked at me, his eyes hollow. He said he was so scared that he didn't know what else to do. He said he never wanted to hurt me, he just wanted to fix it. In that moment, they weren't monsters. They were my children, broken and twisted by the values of a world that prized the appearance of success over the reality of integrity. A profound sadness settled over me, a grief for the children I had lost not to death, but to ambition and fear. I looked at them, my heart aching with a sorrowful clarity, and I delivered my judgment. I told them the fraudulent trust was already dissolved. I told them I would not be pressing criminal charges. I would not send my own children to jail. A flicker of hope sparked in their eyes, and I extinguished it. I would not, however, be bailing them out. They would have to face the natural consequences of their own choices. The loans would be called. The businesses would fail. Their carefully crafted worlds would collapse, and they would have to find a way to stand in the rubble on their own. Then I delivered the final blow. I told them that Sea Glass, the beautiful house they saw as a bundle of assets to be liquidated, would not be sold to pay their debts. Instead, its new purpose would be to house the Beatrice Marlowe Music Foundation. Its vast fortune would be used to provide scholarships to gifted young students who, like me all those years ago, had the talent for places like Juilliard, but lacked the means. I was taking the dream I had sacrificed for my family and giving it to strangers. That was the true punishment. It wasn't the loss of the money. It was the public knowledge that their mother, the woman they had dismissed as simple and irrelevant, would be using the wealth and status they so desperately craved, not for vanity, but for purpose. They were left with nothing but the consequences of their own choices, the bitter taste of their own values. They weren't just financially broke. They were morally bankrupt, and now the world would know it. After they left Sea Glass that Thanksgiving, a profound quiet settled over the house, a quiet I hadn't known in my own home for months. It wasn't the silence of loneliness, but the silence of peace. The storm had passed. In the days and weeks that followed, I didn't hear from them directly, but the aftershocks of their collapse reached me through news from old family acquaintances and the occasional somber update from Ms. Albright. I pictured the scenes of the immediate fallout like a film playing in my mind. I saw Amanda and her husband in their perfect Greenwich home, the air thick with vicious, cutting arguments as the truth of her financial fraudulence came to light. I imagined the swift, brutal efficiency of their separation, another casualty of a life built on appearances. I could almost see the bright red "for sale" sign being hammered into their manicured lawn, a public declaration of their failure. And Michael, I saw him alone in his sleek Manhattan apartment, the skyline that was once a symbol of his ambition, now just a cold, indifferent witness to his ruin. I pictured him packing his expensive suits and custom furniture into cardboard boxes, the lawyer's letters piling up on the counter, each one a nail in the coffin of the life he had built. He had lost everything because he was terrified of losing anything. 6 months later, the separate paths they had chosen were starkly clear. Word reached me that Amanda was working in a high-end retail boutique in a neighboring town. A friend of a friend had seen her there, her face a tight mask of bitterness as she folded cashmere sweaters. When her old acquaintance from Greenwich had approached her with a kind word, Amanda had reportedly looked right through her, her eyes cold with a resentment that had poisoned her from the inside out. She had lost her fortune and her status, and in her mind it was everyone's fault but her own. She had cut off all contact. Michael's story was different. Hitting absolute rock bottom had shattered his arrogance in a way Amanda's shame never could. I learned he was living in a small apartment in Queens and working a simple accounting job. Ms. Albright, through her own channels, heard he had joined a support group. I would sometimes imagine him sitting on a folding chair in a church basement, speaking to a circle of strangers. I could almost hear him admitting for the first time in his life that his entire sense of self had been tied to his success, that the fear of being seen as a failure had driven him to betray the one person who had only ever loved him. It wasn't redemption, not yet, but it was the first painful step on a long road toward accountability. While their worlds were shrinking, mine was expanding. Sea glass transformed. The quiet, formal rooms came alive. I reconnected with Eleanor and other old friends, their laughter echoing in the halls. The Beatrice Marlowe Music Foundation became a reality, and soon the house was filled not with tension and greed, but with the soaring notes of a Chopin etude and the hopeful energy of young artists. I hosted the first round of scholarship auditions in the grand living room. Watching a young girl from Bridgeport, her hands flying across the piano keys with a talent that was raw and breathtaking, I felt a sense of purpose so profound it brought tears to my eyes. This was my legacy. This was my victory. A full year passed. It was a crisp autumn evening, 1 year to the day, since I had received that life-changing letter. I was sitting on the veranda of Sea Glass, watching the sun set over the Sound, a wash of orange and purple across the water. The mail was on a small table beside me, and in it was a single thin envelope with my name and address written in a familiar hand. It was from Michael. My fingers trembled slightly as I opened it. It wasn't a long letter. There were no excuses, no pleas for forgiveness or money. It was just a few simple, honest sentences. He wrote that he was sorry, that he knew the damage he had done was immense, and that he expected nothing from me. He just wanted me to know that he was trying every day to become a man worthy of the mother he had so badly failed. I read the letter twice, then folded it carefully. I looked out at the fading light, my heart filled with a complex, aching mix of sorrow for everything we had lost, and a faint, fragile glimmer of hope for the son who was finally, painfully finding his way back. I didn't reply, but I didn't throw the letter away either. I placed it on the table, and as the first cool evening stars began to appear, I turned back towards the house. From inside, I could hear the sound of a piano, a young artist practicing a difficult passage filling the night with music. The boundary between my past and my future was permanent, but for the first time, I felt a sense of peace on my own terms. In the end, Beatrice's greatest victory wasn't found in her children's ruin, but in her own rebirth. She came to understand that the most devastating betrayals often grow from seeds of desperation and shame, not simple greed. Her children, so terrified of being seen as failures, sacrificed their humanity for the illusion of status. Her ultimate justice then wasn't to destroy them, but to build a legacy of purpose from the wreckage of their choices. She proved that true wealth is not what you possess, but the peace you find when you refuse to be defined by anyone else's fear.